for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. My name is Darren Gibson.
And my name is Jack Prince.
We've got a very special episode for you today. We're going to be talking about the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. This is a program we've been wanting to do for quite a long time. We're going to talk about what the First Amendment covers, what it doesn't cover, and how we've gotten to the point that we are today with the First Amendment. So let's get right into it. Couple of reminders, you can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Twitter at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or Reason.fm by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern, and you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and KEPJ in San Antonio, Texas. Please listen to us there. So, the First Amendment is definitely the first, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the First Amendment. But I want to start this show with George Carlin, because Carlin talks about freedom, and it's an interesting discussion. So let's just go ahead and play this clip. This runs about 4 minutes. The genius of George Carlin, folks. Take a good listen to this.
Boy, everyone in this country's always running around yammering about their fucking rights. I have a right, you have no right, we have a right, they don't have a right. Folks, I hate to spoil your fun, but there's no such thing as rights, okay? They're imaginary. We made them up, like the boogeyman. The Three Little Pigs, Pinocchio, Mother Goose, shit like that. Rights are an idea. They're just imaginary. They're a cute idea, cute, but that's all, cute and fictional. But if you think you do have rights, let me ask you this. Where do they come from? People say, well, they come from God. They're God-given rights. Oh, here we go again. Here we go again. The God excuse, the last refuge of a man with no answers and no argument. It came from God. Anything we can't describe must have come from God. Personally, folks, I believe that if your rights came from God, He would have given you the right to some food every day, and He would have given you the right to a roof over your head. God would have been looking out for you. He wouldn't have been worried about making sure you have a gun so you can get drunk on Sunday night and kill your girlfriend's parents. But let's say it's true. Let's say God gave us these rights. Why would He give us a certain number of rights? The Bill of Rights in this country has 10 stipulations, okay? 10 rights. And apparently God was doing sloppy work that week because we've had to amend the Bill of Rights an additional 17 times. So God forgot a couple of things like slavery. Just f***ing slipped his mind. But let's say God gave us the original 10. He gave the British 13. The British Bill of Rights has 13 stipulations. The Germans have 29. The Belgians have 25. The Swedish have only 6. And some people in the world have no rights at all. What kind of a fucking goddamn God-given deal is that? No rights at all? Why would God give different people in different countries different numbers of different rights? Boredom? Amusement? Bad arithmetic? Do we find out at long last, after all this time, that God is weak in math skills? Doesn't sound like divine planning to me. Sounds more like human planning. Sounds more like one group trying to control another group. In other words, business as usual in America. Now, If you think you do have rights, one last assignment for you. Next time you're at the computer, get on the internet, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia, in the search field for Wikipedia, I want you to type in Japanese Americans 1942, and you'll find out all about your precious rights, okay? All right. You know about it. You know about it. Yeah. In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens in good standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps. Just when these American citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away. And rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're privileges. That's all we've ever had in this country is a bill of temporary privileges. And if you read the news even badly, you know that every year the list gets shorter and shorter and shorter. Sooner or later, the people in this country are going to realize the government does not give a about them. Government doesn't care about you or your children or your rights or your welfare or your safety. It simply doesn't give a about you. It's interested in its own power. That's the only thing, keeping it and expanding it wherever possible. Personally, when it comes to rights, I think one of two things is true. I think either we have unlimited rights or we have no rights at all.
And that was George Carlin. Jack, I believe this is the first time you've heard this. What do you think?
I think it's beautiful. The statement unequivocally at the end that we either have unlimited rights or no rights at all. You know, you could break that down for many, many shows, Darren.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so let's go ahead and let's talk about the one bill that we always talk about on this show. It's
First
my
Amendment.
Favorite amendment. Not the second. If you want to hear about the Second Amendment, go turn to Fox Propaganda Channel or whatever.
Go to Smith & Wesson. They got it written on the back of their license plate.
Yeah. Let's talk about the First Amendment. And there was a reason that the founding fathers of this country made it the First Amendment. So I'm actually going to Wikipedia here. The First Amendment was adopted on December 15th, 1791 as one of the 10 amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was proposed to assuage anti-federalist opposition to constitutional ratification. Initially, the First Amendment applied only to laws enacted by the Congress. Many of its provisions were interpreted more narrowly than they are today. So the First Amendment is applied to states through the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause through the Supreme Court case Gitlow versus New York, which is from 1925. So what does the First Amendment say? Here's how it reads. It's really simple. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So let's break it down. Congress shall make no law. That's important. Congress cannot make any laws establishing a religion, prohibiting you from exercising your religion, exercising your right to free speech or free press. So they can't start in with the censorship. There are limited examples, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this show here. The people have the right to peaceably assemble. The people have the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So let's talk about the first part. Establishing religion, because we've been told all throughout history when we were in school, Jack, that the first settlers came here from Europe to get away from religious oppression. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that is why that is in the Constitution. It says that The government cannot establish a religion. You have the right to exercise your religion, regardless of whether it's Catholic, Quaker, Baptist, Lutheran, you name the sect of Christianity, or even Islam, Buddhism, you name it. Or for that matter, if you don't want to follow a religion, if you're agnostic or if you're atheist.
But see, this isn't definitive. Its boundaries can fluctuate so far, Darren,
Absolutely.
that you need to get the spirit, really, of these words, which, as you've already mentioned, are very succinct, right? For example, when you say that there will be no prohibiting of the free exercise of religion, it's actually worded, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and the thereof pertains to religion.
Yep.
If your religion says that you believe in child sacrifice, or if your religion believes that you can pick up deadly snakes and that your Sunday school department play with them, that then means that the federal government, the local government, the law institution can prohibit that exercise of your religion.
Because it is affecting somebody else.
Because it infringes on other rights.
Exactly. The rights of other people.
Exactly. So this isn't concrete. It's flexible enough for you to use some thinking and critical thinking for its interpretation, which you know who has no critical thinking and takes these things either literally or refuses to stretch the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the literalists, that's the conservatives who say, no, it means what it says, and that's what's going to be implemented.
Yes.
So if you come to my church and you tell me I can't teach that black people were a cursed group from Ham, and therefore they can be discriminated against, which is a contradiction of other parts of the Constitution, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can't do anything about that. I can teach that to my children, or to my...
Yep.
That's inflexibility. That means the boundaries of these words cannot be moved, expanded upon.
Yep. Religious liberty, and I'm reading this from Wikipedia, religious liberty, also known as freedom of religion, has been identified by some as the right of all persons to believe, speak, and act individually and in community with others, in private and in public, in accordance with their understanding of ultimate truth. That's coming from the religious folks.
Oh, I did miss it.
Yeah. The acknowledgement of religious freedom as the first right protected in the Bill of Rights points toward the American founders' understanding of the importance of religion to human, social, and political flourishing. But again, that was back in the 1780s, 1790s. Things have changed. Things have evolved. 1/4 of this country, a full 25% of this country, are either agnostic or atheist.
And it's growing.
And it's growing. It's the fastest growing religion if it were a religion. And it's number 3 in this country. And I think it might be number 2 now. So, yeah, things do change. And that's why it's important. That's why the Founding Fathers have referred to this as a living document. It's not, we wrote it, that's the way it is. No.
It morphs.
It does morph. And that's why the Founding Fathers set up the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution for things that are happening today.
Are we saying, Darren, are you saying that in the 1700s, things are more static and it was a more black and white society? We are saying that safely, aren't we?
Yes.
It wasn't nearly
very
as
safely.
complex as today's society.
Exactly.
Right. But would you went to dunk the woman in the river and kill her because she was a witch?
Yeah.
If that was in the 1700s. Could we have extrapolated that maybe we could interfere with that religious practice?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can extrapolate that for the next 300 years after that as well.
Yeah. You absolutely can. Let me continue reading this here. Freedom of religion is protected by the First Amendment through its Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause, which together form the religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment. Again, that's more sourced information here. The first clause prohibits any government establishment of religion. The second prohibits any governmental interference with the free exercise thereof. The Establishment Clause is why public schools cannot teach religion unless it's in a historical context. Correct?
Correct.
As a retired educator of 30 years.
Right. And also of a generational child of the Vietnam War, where it was respected, the government respected the religious belief of those who called themselves pacifists.
Mm-hmm.
And they were therefore not drafted.
Yeah.
And the people who were drafted were saying, that's a crock of bull.
Yeah. Or if they were drafted, they were not put into combat. They were stationed in other areas, medics or whatever.
Yet when Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay, said, I will not go and kill brown people, they never called me the N-word, nor have they ever put me in chains. That opinion and that belief, because it wasn't termed as religious, meant he was punished. He was penalized.
Yes. Yes. We'll get into the free speech aspect here. But yeah, the Establishment Clause is the reason why there are groups still around to this day, among them the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which they do tremendous work. We've had representatives of that organization on this show as guests in the past. This is why my school district was sued when I was going to school, because they were holding a Bible study during school hours on school property, and they're not allowed to do it. That's why we have MACRA over on the lakeshore here in Michigan, the Michigan Association of Civil Rights Activists. And they've worked with Freedom from Religion Foundation as well. That's why we have the ACLU. I mean, like I said, my school district, Tri-County Schools, was sued in the 1980s for this, and they lost in court. They were sued by a guy that we know at least I know very well, Alan Mackey, who, by the way, does his own podcast these days. He's living in Texas. He ran for Congress as a communist, but he lived right by me. I knew him very well growing up, and Al was right in his beliefs. You cannot use public funds to teach religion in public schools. Although nowadays,
You can today.
they're trying to do that in several states with the voucher laws that Betsy DeVos came up with years ago and things
Darren,
like that. Florida, for example.
There has been legislation in this state that says you can use public money for private. Private here is synonymous with religious education.
Yeah.
Which is complete
ridiculous.
contradiction of the term no law respecting or establishment of religion.
Yep.
If I'm giving you public money for your religious school, that's establishment of religion. And it's happening right here, as Darren just said, because of the impetus of Betsy DeVos. It's happening in Michigan. It was enacted about 4 months ago, and very few people, other than the Southpaw Radio's voice, even reflected upon it. Mm-hmm. It went right underneath the radar. We're too worried about the Bachelorette or who was the next NCAA football Final Four, because they missed this complete violation here in Michigan. The Grid didn't miss it. Jeff Smith didn't miss it.
Yeah.
Southpaws didn't miss it.
Yeah. I'm going to read this here. This is a dissenting opinion from Justice William O. Douglas in the case of Mcgowan versus Maryland. I'm going to read this here. Douglas illustrated the broad protections offered by the First Amendment's religious liberty clauses. Here's what he wrote. The First Amendment commands government to have no interest in theology or ritual. It admonishes government to be interested in allowing religious freedom to flourish, whether the result is to produce Catholics, Jews, or Protestants, or to turn the people toward the path of Buddha, or to end in a predominantly Muslim nation, or to produce in the long run atheists or agnostics. On matters of this kind, government must be neutral. This freedom plainly includes freedom from religion, with the right to believe, speak, write, publish, and advocate anti-religious programs. Board of Education versus Barnett. is what he cites. Certainly, the free exercise clause does not require that everyone embrace the theology of some church or of some faith or observe the religious practices of any majority or minority sect. The First Amendment, by its establishment clause, prevents, of course, the selection of government of an official church, yet the ban plainly extends farther than that. We said in Everson versus Board of Education that it would be an establishment of a religion if the government financed one church or several churches. For what better way to establish an institution than to find the funds that will support it?
Exactly.
The Establishment Clause protects citizens also against any law which selects any religious custom, practice, or ritual, puts the force of government behind it, and fines, imprisons, or otherwise penalizes a person for not observing it. The government plainly cannot join forces with one religious group and decree a universal and symbolic circumcision, nor could it require all children to be baptized or give tax exemptions only to those whose children were baptized. That's a direct quote from Justice William Douglas. Now, what is Mcgowan versus Maryland? It was a Supreme Court case in 1961. The court held that laws with religious origins are not unconstitutional if they have a secular purpose. So again, the goalpost is moving, as we keep talking about. Mm-hmm. So that's the exercise of religion, freedom of it, and then the Establishment Clause, of course. Thomas Jefferson, in his famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, where he said a wall of separation between church and state. Actually, I'm going to read this excerpt here. This is from 1802. From Thomas Jefferson. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law establishing an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. Again, that's Thomas Jefferson.
Let's put some practical application here, Darren, if we can. So the state has a wall between it and religious beliefs.
In
correct?
theory. In
theory. Kind of like what Carlin said.
Yes.
So the state has a mask mandate, had a mask mandate here in Michigan, did it not?
Yes.
And many other states, if not all 51 states.
Yes.
Had mask mandates in secondary schools.
Yes.
The state said for safety of our citizens, they must wear a mask 5 days a week in school.
Yes.
But John, conservative, Baptist fundamentalist, comes to the board meeting, dominates the time saying, my little child doesn't have to wear a mask because our religious beliefs are contrary even to science, i.e. doctors, and particularly state mandates, like we already mentioned, integrating black students with white students.
Yes.
Their belief was that you can't do that. Their belief also said in this state, we don't have to follow your state mandate because our law in the BIBLE trumps that, no pun missed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So a practical application, who's correct then? Does the state say unequivocally every student that comes in the door must have a mask on? Your religious beliefs would endanger the other students. Is it not a clear question practically applied?
Yeah, it absolutely is.
That religious belief has no weight.
That's right.
Because we're not a theocracy. Our state makes the rules, and if your religion contradicts those, that's too damn bad.
We're not a theocracy yet. I'm dreading the possibility that might actually happen in this country because of conservatives.
There's powers working on that very thing. You mentioned Betsy DeVos. They believe that their dear Lord cannot return until all of the government leadership is under Christian authority. That's not hyperbole in any way.
Yeah. Betsy DeVos, Donald Trump, all these, what I like to call evil, violent, conservative savages. These are people that cherry pick the Bible for their own purpose, and they don't read the entire document. They just don't. We've proved that in past shows. Let's continue here. And actually, let's move on to the next portion of the Constitution. Freedom of speech. Now, can you just go around saying everything that pops into your mind? Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that. You might offend people, which we have offended people with this show, and rightfully so. But you can't just say anything that immediately comes to your mind. There are laws against it. Well, if that's the case, well, then there shouldn't be laws against lying about somebody, which slander is spoken, libel is printed. So if I print a lie about somebody, I shouldn't, under the First Amendment, shouldn't be sued for libel, should I? That's not how it works, folks. There has to be some regulation, and the libel and slander is one thing, and we'll get to some others.
If you take this literally,
yeah,
freedom of speech means you have the freedom to say anything you want. Yes, the theater is on fire. Your neighbor is an alien who's eating children in his basement. It makes no difference, right? So again, guess who wants to take it literally? And look at the damage that occurs.
Yes, indeed. Again, reading from Wikipedia. The First Amendment broadly protects the rights of free speech and free press. Free speech means the free and public expression of opinions without censorship, interference, and restraint by the government. The term freedom of speech embedded in the First Amendment encompasses the decision what to say as well as what not to say. Again, that is according to the Supreme Court Justice Riley versus the National Federation of the Blind, which is a 1988 court decision. So there are exceptions to total free speech. I have another Wikipedia article. Inciting somebody to commit suicide is not protected by the First Amendment. That was ruled in 2017. A juvenile court in Massachusetts ruled that repeatedly encouraging someone to commit suicide was not protected by the First Amendment. A 20-year-old woman who was 17 at the time was found guilty of manslaughter on that basis.
I remember the case.
Apparently, the judge in the case cited a little-known 1816 precedent. So, yeah. False statements of fact are not protected by the First Amendment. So, defamation, libel, slander, etc.
That's legal?
That is not legal. You cannot libel or slander someone.
Okay, but I mean, that is a legal document?
That is, yes.
From this ruling?
Yeah. This is a different ruling. So that was one case. So in the case of defamation, Gertz versus Robert Welch, Inc., 1974, the Supreme Court said there is no constitutional value in false statements of fact. So why is Donald Trump running around running his mouth? That's what I'd like to know.
Because he takes this freedom of speech and uses it as a blanket that means full and complete freedom of speech. It's not. But if I just read this right here, I could argue that it does mean unequivocal full freedom of speech. It doesn't stipulate, Darren. It just says freedom of speech,
Yep.
Which means we as human beings have to apply it to our cultural event in contemporary times,
Yep.
and other laws and other amendments,
Exactly.
which they won't do. They isolate it. They cherry pick it just like they do the Bible.
Yep, exactly. However, this is not a concrete rule, as the court has struggled with how much of the speech that matters can be put at risk in order to punish a falsehood. So the Supreme Court has been struggling with this for a number of years now. Again, libel and slander, that's why you got to be very careful, especially if you're reporting stuff, that if you're giving an opinion, state your opinion as opinion. Don't state it as fact, because you will get sued every single time and you will lose every single time. Let's see. The Supreme Court has established a complex framework for determining which type of false statements are unprotected. There are 4 such areas which the court has been explicit about. First, false statements of fact that are said with a sufficiently culpable mental state can be subject to civil or criminal liability. Second, knowingly making a false statement of fact can sometimes be punished. That libel and slander falls under that. Third, negligently false statements of fact may lead to civil liability in some instances. Lastly, some implicit statements of fact, those that have a false factual connotation, falls under the exception as well. There's also a 5th category. It is possible some completely false statements could be entirely free from punishment. So that would be like satire. A landmark case was held in 1964, New York Times versus Sullivan. The Supreme Court ruled that the freedom of speech protections in the First Amendment restrict the ability of American public officials to sue for defamation. One of my favorite cases involving free speech is Falwell versus Flint. Jerry Falwell, the religious nut job, may burn in hell.
Yep.
Yeah. Sued Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flint several years ago. And if you actually watch the movie The People versus Larry Flint, I highly recommend that movie. Larry Flint is a champion of the First Amendment, or he was while he was still alive. Jerry Falwell sued Flint because in Hustler magazine, Larry Flint published a liquor ad that was labeled as a parody, specifically labeled as parody. I believe it was for Campari or something. I forgot which liquor. They were doing a series of ads at the time where you talk about your first time drinking Campari or whatever liquor it was. Larry Flint used a Campari ad and spoofed Jerry Falwell. What was your first time having sex? And in this parody ad, Falwell is depicted as having sex with his mother in an outhouse in Lynchburg, Virginia, or whatever. Falwell took immense offense to it and
I should
sued.
think so. It wasn't in Virginia. It was in Tennessee.
Oh, good Lord. So,
I'm not sure the Lord's good.
yeah. So Falwell sued Flint for defamation for multiple millions of dollars. Larry Flint took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that parody is protected free speech, just like political cartoons are protected free speech. You have the right to mock certain individuals, I believe the Supreme Court calls them public officials. Now, Jerry Falwell was not an elected politician, but because of his reach of his television networks and everything else, being a televangelist, he is considered a public official. So his protections against libel slander are less because he is a public official.
Please allow me to indulge here a second.
Yeah.
Is this not the same Falwell family whose
Oh, God, here we go.
son,
Yeah.
little Falwell,
Jerry Jr. and his sexual
had a
peccadillos.
wife, maybe they're still married, I'm not sure, who could not keep the pool boy out of her bed.
There's audio of this. This is great.
He not only cleaned the pool, he tended to Mrs. Falwell.
He snaked out some of the other plumbing as well.
Is that the same Falwell family? Just curious.
It absolutely is.
Now, wait a second. Now, am I liable here? Let's.
No, you're reporting. You are reporting facts.
Thank you.
Yeah. Fact, by the way, the ultimate defense against libel and slander is fact. There is no other defense against it. Either you have the facts or you don't. If you do, you're good. If you don't, you're in trouble. It's that simple, folks. Yeah, so let's get to some more exceptions for free speech. You know, counterfeit currency is considered a free speech issue? Did you know this?
You have a right to counterfeit?
No, you don't. Laws against counterfeit U.S. currency and even some photographic and artistic reproductions which cannot be feasibly passed off as real currency have been consistently upheld. So, yeah. So, This is crazy stuff here. Obscenity. We just played George Carlin at the beginning of this episode. FCC versus Pacifica. This station airs on Pacifica radio stations.
Yes, we are a member.
Pacifica, back in 1973, played Carlin's 7 Dirty Words on the air, which we won't repeat any of those words on this episode. They fought the Federal Communications Commission and said, hey, free speech. Nope. And they said, nope, it's... They've applied a standard, the Miller test, Miller versus California. Here's how the test goes. Speech is unprotected if, according to the Supreme Court, if the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the subject or work in question taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. The work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law, and that the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value.
In layman's term, words that you wouldn't say in front of your 10-year-old granddaughter.
Most people. I don't want to talk about
that has boundaries.
What some parents teach their children, but... Oh, God. Some subsidiary components of this rule may permit private possession of obscene materials at one's home. Additionally, the phrase appeals to the prurient interest is limited to appeals to a shameful or morbid interest in sex. So, most men. All right. The court has held that a person may only be punished if he knows the actual contents of the material. In Smith versus California, the Supreme Court thus gave a defense of reasonable ignorance to an obscenity charge. Now, hold on here. I thought for years the phrase, ignorance of the law is no excuse, applied to pretty much everything. Now we got the Supreme Court in Smith versus California saying, hold it, not so fast.
What happened in the canoe case here in Michigan where the woman on the bank heard the guy paddling the canoe and used the offensive language? I didn't hear the ruling. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I absolutely do, and I don't remember the ruling on that either. We'll have to take a look at that here.
Is that on the Muskegon River, I'm thinking?
We actually have the answer to that thanks to the American Civil Liberties Union. This was a press release back on April 1st of 2002. In a case that drew international attention, a Michigan appeals court today struck down a 105-year-old law used to convict a man dubbed the cussing canoeist, saying that the law unquestionably operates to inhibit the exercise of First Amendment rights.
There you go.
The ACLU of Michigan defended Roseville resident Timothy Boomer. So he was booming out obscenities on the river in his canoe. He was convicted in August 1998. He had fallen out of his canoe on the Rifle River.
Oh, yeah.
So he fell out and started yelling a stream of profanities within earshot of a woman and her 2 children. So he was prosecuted under an 1897 Michigan law that prohibited using indecent, immoral, vulgar, or insulting language in the presence or hearing of women or children. In the ruling on April 1st, 2002, Michigan Supreme Court Justice William B. Murphy, writing for the court, said this, quote, allowing a prosecution where one utters insulting language could possibly subject a vast percentage of the populace to a misdemeanor conviction.
That's true.
End of quote. He further added, quote, we find it unquestionable that the law as drafted reaches constitutionally protected speech and it operates to inhibit the exercise of First Amendment rights. End of quote.
So boil that down for me, Darren.
You can cuss in front of women and children, and they can't do a thing about it. Not in Michigan. But other states may have their own laws, and their own courts might rule a certain way. So, again.
But you could not cuss in front of women and children if it was in a manner that was threatening their safety.
No.
Or degrading their race or their religion.
That's under other laws, too.
See how these things all overlap?
Everything's all interconnected with each other. Child pornography, obviously, is not protected under the First Amendment. because you're harming children.
Exactly. And should we even think about that?
Yeah. Fighting words. Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, 1942. The U.S. Supreme Court held that speech is unprotected if it constitutes fighting words, defined by the court as speech that tends to incite an immediate breach of the peace by provoking a fight, so long as it is a personally abusive word which, when addressed to the ordinary citizen as a matter of common knowledge, inherently is likely to provoke a violent reaction. So, additionally, such speech must be directed to the person of the hearer and is thus likely to be seen as a direct personal insult. So, if you go up to somebody and you tell them that their mom wears combat boots and they punch you in the face for it, guess what? You incited them. Now, if they continue beating you, that's a different story. That's assault because they didn't stop. They went beyond stopping you.
But if she is in the military, what does that do?
It could be a compliment if she's in the military.
Exactly.
Who knows? Threatening the president of the United States is not protected. You will immediately get a visit from the Secret Service and immediately go to jail. Ask Ted Nugent.
But a conservative numbskull pundit can say we need to kill Democrats.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah, and I can't remember it either.
Don't want to.
Which one? There's been probably several.
Yeah.
Speech owned by others. So copyright, trademark laws, things like that, which is why we have the disclaimer at the end of our show that this show is protected by copyright. It's copyrighted Big D Entertainment. So nobody can use this unless they're picking apart our broadcast. So like with the news, because we're an analysis show, we can take news clips and play them on the air, and as long as we're analyzing it, it's protected because it's called fair use.
Right.
But we can't just decide, we're going to take half an hour of the show and we're just going to rerun NBC Nightly News without comment. Because then we are violating the copyright that the National Broadcasting Company has on that broadcast. So that's how the copyright infringement laws work. Commercial speech is a really interesting exception.
It sure is.
So, yeah, there have been cases, JCPenney versus Cynthia Spann. Cynthia Spann argued in court that JCPenney was using false advertising on their sales. She did eventually win that court case, by the way. So, yeah, there are certain things you can't say in commercial speech.
But there's certain things you can say.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they ruled that you can lie commercially. You can tell lies. I can't remember the case. The journalists, I think from Fox, were talking about that additive to the cows.
Yeah.
And the judge said they can lie.
Yeah.
Companies can lie.
They've said, and the courts have ruled that cops can lie to you when they're interrogating you, which is mind-boggling to me. It's insane. Let's see. Restrictions based on special capacity of government. So the government is not permitted to fire an employee based on the employee's speech if these three criteria are met. The speech addresses a matter of public concern. The speech is not made pursuant to the employee's job duties, but the speech is made in the capacity as a citizen, and the damage inflicted on the government by the speech does not outweigh the value of the speech to the employee and to the public. So that's basically the Pickering test. Pickering versus Board of Education. You can look at that up on Wikipedia as well. Of course, the FCC regulates the airwaves, which is why we're not allowed to lie about people on the air. Yeah, this is some interesting stuff here. Prior restraint is another one. I want to talk about prior restraint for a minute. Typically, prior restraint is when the government says, you can't talk about this on the news. There is an exception for it, and it's one that is very sparingly used, and that is called national defense. So, for example, during World War II, let's say that the Associated Press learns of an attack that's coming. They've got the plans for the attack. The government can legally tell the Associated Press, You are not to publish that information because it is affecting national security. That is the only exception under prior restraint.
But what about prior restraint you see exercised all the time by officials that say there's litigation going on? I cannot comment on that. To a direct question.
You know, that's a very good question. I've never thought of it like that way. But, yeah, again, it's moving the goalpost. It's how do we balance the right of the public to know versus the right of the government to protect itself while it's under litigation.
So are these rights so fluid and so mobile and undefinable that Carlin is correct?
I think he is. We either have no rights or we have all the rights.
Say anything.
Yeah. So, yeah. Carlin is correct, I think. I mean, it's
intriguing.
It is very intriguing. I mean, heck, the government back in the 30s and 40s were censoring movies.
Yeah.
You know? Then Hollywood said, okay, government, we'll do this for you. We will put out a rating system, and we will rate movies before they are released to the theaters, and we will publish the rating of that movie on the posters and in our advertising for the movies, which is why you got G-rated movies, PG, PG-13, R. They used to, the X was not solidified by the Motion Picture Association. That was just added. They decided to add it later on with the NC-17. So that is officially the Hollywood version of the X rating.
Is prayer free speech?
What do you mean prayer?
Well, our law says you can't pray in school, remember? Right?
No, the law is actually that teachers cannot lead students in prayer on school property during school hours.
See, I'm very familiar with this because I had a player in a locker room want to have a prayer. Okay.
If the students lead it, they can. Administrators can't.
But the door was open. The locker room door was open. And I was called in for having that prayer being heard by people outside of the team as a reflection of the policy of that school. That's where it got murky. Now, you remember the famous case that maybe sets the precedence here was a woman named Madeline O'Hara.
Madeline Murray O'Hara, another champion of the First Amendment.
Exactly. And that was before it was even popular to challenge religiosity in schools and prayer. I was in a public school. Once a month, we had a Sunday school teacher come in for a full school assembly where he had a little felt board, and he would tell Bible stories to the whole school. And it was never challenged.
And this was a student that did this?
No, it was a youth pastor. I taught in another school.
Was this before school operated? Before the school day started?
No, second or third hour of the day.
Wow. Yeah, that should have been challenged.
You're damn right it should have been challenged. I have seen in 30 years of teaching numerous violations all over the place. I heard a principal one time say, we went through 3 interviews. I sat in interviews as the assistant principal, and the principal, as they all left, said, well, there's 4 or 5 candidates we've listened to today. They're all very qualified, but one of them's a Christian. That's our guy.
Wow.
If I had squawked, I probably would have lost my job. So I squawked to him personally. He apologized, but it goes on every day.
Yeah, it certainly does. How do you get personal biases out of decision-making? You know, that's another topic for another time.
I tell people, you want to be
really it is.
a Republican politician? There's just 3 things you have to do. Get yourself a little cross, put it on your left lapel, and get another sign, we support the troops, put that on your right lapel, and put a NASCAR sticker on your car, and you're in.
By the way, the First Amendment also protects citizens from being compelled to say speech or to pay for certain speech, which is why students are no longer required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And if any teacher does so, as a parent, you need to go to the school and you need to threaten to sue them for $100 million because they'll stop immediately. They will lose in court every single time.
I hope that continues.
Yep. By the way, that ruling came from the West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court then ruled that school children cannot be punished for refusing to either say the Pledge of Allegiance or to salute the U.S. flag. That decision overruled Minersville School District versus Gobitis, which was 3 years earlier.
Folks, the public schools violate the Constitution so readily it would shock you. GRPS had, I taught summer school, a class right next to mine where they were teaching abstinence from a biblical perspective. They came to the school, they presented their credentials as a church group, and without anybody noticing, they had a class going on during school hours. Mm-hmm. They got caught and they stopped it. There should have been a lawsuit. There wasn't. But it's violated continuously in public schools, daily.
Several years ago on this show, we had Caitlin Campbell as a guest on this show. She fought her school because they were teaching abstinence only during a school assembly. She was the school valedictorian, and they were threatening to take it away from her.
And the outcome?
And the outcome? She was still valedictorian.
Because she was correct.
Because she was correct, and because the media picked up on it, and the school principal didn't want to face the blowback of it.
But
which would have been a lawsuit.
The biggest reason for these violations is sheer ignorance of this amendment.
Oh, it's not even that. It's they want to override it. I'm not going to have the government tell me what to do.
Exactly.
So there's that aspect of it as well. A lot of it's ignorance, but a lot of it is screw the government. They're not going to tell me what to do.
But also my experience is a lot of these administrators in public schools where I spent a whole lifetime are completely ignorant of violation of the Constitution. Like the principal who used a religious bias to make a public school decision. It didn't dawn on him that was a violation.
Yeah. I actually want to move on to the last part of the First Amendment. It protects the right of the people to petition the government and to assemble for a redress of grievances. The right to protest originally came out of the Magna Carta. However, that right has been expanded over the years since the ratification of the First Amendment. The right to petition the government for redress of grievances includes the right to communicate with government officials, lobbying government officials, and petitioning the courts by filing lawsuits with a legal basis. The petition clause first came to prominence in the 1830s when Congress established the gag rule, barring anti-slavery petitions from being heard. That rule was overturned by Congress several years later. Petitions against the Espionage Act of 1917 resulted in imprisonments. By the way, the U.S. Supreme Court did not rule on either of the two issues. The right of assembly is the individual right of people to come together and collectively express, promote, pursue, and defend their collective or shared ideas. This right is equally important as those of free speech and free press. The Supreme Court in DeYoung versus Oregon in 1937 stated that the right of peaceable assembly is cognate to those of free speech and free press and is equally fundamental. It is one that cannot be denied without violating those fundamental principles of liberty and justice which lie at the base of all civil and political institutions, principles which the 14th Amendment embodies in the general terms of its Due Process Clause. The holding of meetings for peaceable political action cannot be proscribed. Those who assist in the conduct of such meetings cannot be branded as criminals on that score. So while the courts have expanded the rights to petition and to assemble, there are a lot of municipalities that still don't get it. I'm going to say it right here, something that I've said on the air for a number of years. Any city that tells you that you need to pay for a permit to assemble is violating the First Amendment because you have to pay, and that violates the Constitution. Period. End of story. My opinion.
What they should say in print in a star a little at the bottom of this, the right to assemble with certain requirements met.
Mm-hmm.
That's how the cities see it. But your point is well taken. Why submit to a charge? If you have the right to assemble, that's without financial obligation.
Exactly. One other the ability to use amplifying equipment to project. A lot of cities will say, oh, no, you can't bring in a speaker, you can't use a loudspeaker, you can't use a megaphone. To me, that's a violation as well. What is the purpose of assembling to petition for a redress of grievances?
It doesn't say anything in this amendment about assembling on private property.
Exactly.
Does it?
No.
And yet I've been taught through my years of activism, you better not assemble on private property unless you have the permission of the private property owner.
Absolutely. Which is why for many years, Meijer tried to get away with that. The local grocer based here in Grand Rapids didn't want striking workers on their property, and they got sued over it, to the point that to this day, at Christmas time, you don't see Salvation Army kettle ringers at the doors of Meijer, because it was, if you let one in, you have to let them all in. And the courts told Meijer that. So they said, okay, we won't let anybody in. No soliciting. No striking on our property. Therefore, no Salvation Army bell ringers at Christmas time.
How has the egregious police force in our cities gotten around this amendment, Darren Gibson? I'll tell you firsthand. A public street, a public sidewalk, we have full right to assemble, correct?
Yes.
Wrong. All they have to do, because it happened to me, is say your assemblage on that sidewalk is a blockage to traffic, is a blockage, or in my case, was an incitement to riot, protesting George Bush in Grand Rapids, walking down a public sidewalk. I was arrested under the guise of inciting a riot. It was a felony. It would have ended my career.
What was the outcome of that?
It was dropped magically. The charges were dropped because they were so flimsily obstructed in the first place, correct?
Yes.
But it doesn't make any difference. The protest was disbanded. Mm-hmm. People were taken off in police cars while exercising their freedom to assemble. And when the smoke cleared and that violation was seen by the police department, not the protesters, they just dropped the case. It doesn't make any difference. It's past then. The moment's gone. The protest is gone. Effectively broken up. That's how they get around it.
So once again, let's ask the question that Carlin asked. Do we have unlimited freedom or do we have no freedom?
We should trust Carlin by now.
We should. We most definitely should. Well, I tell you what, this has been a very interesting conversation, Jack.
I think so.
We need to do this again sometime soon. We'll pick one of the other amendments and we'll discuss it and try and help educate some people as far as what certain amendments do and what they don't.
I must say, before we go, none of this was rehearsed beforehand.
No, it wasn't.
We never even talked about it. We just knew this show had to be done without any previous discussion at all. None of these topics were discussed between the two of us. I assure you.
Absolutely. Let's let Kristen do her thing.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.
And now that we're fully protected, let's go ahead and get out of here for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson.
I'm Jack Prince.
Please support independent media and the First Amendment.